and then I'm going to go right into questioning. So, shall we start with Mr. Petersen?
Sure. Thank you, Attorney Point, USA and ASU for having me here. Thank you to Brandon Tatum and R.C. Maxwell for coming out here tonight. Really appreciate this. For decades, the enemies of the West have been predicting the demise of Western civilization. They look at our experiment in classical liberalism and see chaos and disorder. They see our republic of, by, and for the people and say such things as the atheist West is doomed, or the capitalist West will destroy itself, or that the West is immutably racist. And we should expect those kinds of criticisms from people who expect us to fail. But in recent decades, these criticisms have no longer solely been purveyed by the leaders of our opposition. No, these criticisms are more likely to be heard coming from those who claim to be advocates of Western civilization. Now they are the ones who are predicting our demise, and indeed now seem to be wishing for us to fail, because the freedoms that we enjoy involve people engaging in behaviors they deem to be not virtuous, or to put it another way, degenerate. Like Robespierre, they look at our uncontrollable, wildly individualistic society and declare they wish to purge the world of vice and sin and immigration. But I disagree with these premises, and I will argue tonight that Westernization is inevitable, provided that we exemplify the values that we are founded on. One of them mainly was free immigration. That was the policy that the United States practiced until 1920, with some exceptions, one being the Chinese Exclusion Act, and of course the massive forced importation and servitude of African labor until 1865. I would argue that the values which immigration restrictionists under the current Republican establishment would have us believe are American values are anything but. Instead, as George Will recently stated, conservatives who say they want to make America great again have imported European conservatism. Blood and soil, throne and altar, ethnicity and language. European conservatism is about preserving hierarchies. American conservatism is about reconciling people to constant churning and to the radical openness of spontaneous order. This is dynamism. Consider America's first true experiment with anarcho-capitalism, the Wild West. Rather than a chaotic life of exploitation by robber barons or constant violence like some seen out of Red Dead Redemption, life in the United States during the Gilded Age was one of property rights, gold, and personal liberation under a market system. It was where women became property owners. Homesteading and expansionism thrived alongside industrialization. And during this time, we thrived in part due to our first mass influx of immigration. During the Gilded Age, approximately 20 million immigrants came to the United States. Some of them were prosperous farmers. Many were poor, unskilled immigrants looking for the American dream. And to accommodate this heavy influx, the federal government in 1892 opened a reception center at Ellis Island. And that Ellis Island policy, which I have advocated for and still advocate for to this day, is what we should return to. A security check, a disease check, and done. Now, the Center for Global Development and Michael Clemens has estimated that if everyone could take a job anywhere they wanted, our 75 trillion global world product would experience an instant boost of 50 to 150% annually. Even if you discounted this by 50%, we're still talking about $17 trillion, which is the entire United States economy added every year, just if we allowed anyone to take a job wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Immigrants and their children were responsible for founding 46% of all of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States in 2017. A quarter of all startups have been started by immigrants. But not only is free immigration an economic benefit to the United States, it's a cultural benefit as well. Between 2000 and 2017, immigrants won nearly 40% of American Nobel Prizes. So, what's stopping us from returning to the American experiment of classical liberalism? Fear and ignorance. Fear of the competition from a market economy, and ignorance as to the benefits of free trade and free immigration. In 1855, Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter that read, "As a nation, we begin by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it as all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Amen. And after he became president, on the 4th of July, 1864, Lincoln signed into law a bill titled An Act to Encourage Immigration. So, maybe before Republicans can make America great again, maybe we should focus on making Republicans Lincoln-esque again. Thank you, and I welcome the debate.
And I'll open the floor for Mr. King.
First of all, I want to thank you guys for coming. I'm a very proud, former member of the TPUSA staff. This is what I will say. Thank you to Austin for his presidential speech. I don't have to write down a bunch of stuff and get too deep into it. I just want to be a common sense person that can eloquently articulate to you very clearly what my positions are as a conservative. I believe in the rule of law. I don't believe in open borders. It makes no sense and there's no realistic application. All of the fluff that I just heard a minute ago, no disrespect, it sounds very good, but in application it's not realistic. I believe in strict law enforcement because when you allow people to come into this country unchecked, I know he related to a former position of that, but you let people come into this country unchecked, then you have unlawlessness. People are coming into our country without assimilating. People are bringing drugs into this country and all of the such that we see as problems today in America. So in very short, I'm not in the position to say, or my position is not to say that we should have open borders and lawlessness and legalize all drugs. I think there's a fundamental application to that we have seen being displayed in what we know as America today. So that's the premise on what I'm standing, and then we can get into this debate. Again, thank you, Austin, for showing up for this debate.
Okay, I'm going to get right into it with the questions. The first one is for you, Mr. Tatum. Your opponent here, Mr. Petersen, just expressed no fear of open borders. You alluded to a little bit of your concerns. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, as a former police officer here in the state of Arizona, when you look at what's happening on our border, you look at people who are flooding in here, unchecked, undocumented, they're committing a tremendous amount of crimes, and they're competing unfairly with American citizens. And I believe that if we have a strict border, if we enforce border laws more effectively, we can eliminate some of these problems. One of the biggest examples of the negative effects of people coming into our borders unchecked with very minimal strict border security is fentanyl. Now, I don't know if anybody knows anybody's familiar with how the effects of fentanyl has permeated in the state of Arizona, but it's really bad. And I start with the beginning of my police career in 2011, where I never heard of fentanyl, where heroin addiction and overdose were at a very minimum. Going through my career, I could say about 2014, 2015, heroin and fentanyl got so bad coming from the southern border that we literally had to wear masks, gloves, and an entire, biohazard suit just to check drugs and things that would come in off the street. Over the course of, I could say about 3 to 4 years, we saw an influx. Those things are problematic in conjunction with sex trafficking. Open borders lead to more sex trafficking and the proliferation of the cartel. Very common sense stuff. As cartels are paid and utilized, and they utilize coyotes to bring these people here, they're funded. As they transport drugs back and forth, that is creating a better source for them for funding. So just on the basic principle of the border wall and border security, I believe that we should be more strict. And with open borders, we don't know what else can come into our country, especially when it comes to diseases, especially when it comes to the burden on our criminal justice system, as well as our economy, as well as our infrastructure for taxpayers. All of those things are created by an open border system. As you can tell in many areas when it comes to crime reduction, places like in El Paso, Texas, where they have a strong barrier and they also have strong enforcement, we see a decrease in crime. I mean, just on the other side of the border, we see all hell breaking loose, thousands of people dying per day. Then you look on the American side, we see that it's a relatively safe environment. So I don't see there being a realistic, articulable argument as it relates to having open borders. I do not see the benefit. I know that our country, just real quick, I know that our country was founded on immigration, and immigration is still a positive impact. But illegal immigration is the problem, and that's what the difference is between myself and I believe Austin.
Thank you, thank you. Mr. Petersen, Mr. Tatum is talking about some real serious issues. Do you have a response?
Sure, and with all due respect, I mean, looking at it from the view of a police officer, you have to understand, to some people, to a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So when you're looking at something like the enforcement of the war on drugs there, you're going to get that pro-government viewpoint. But when you're talking about the problems, like the cartels, for example, you have to look at the American experiment with prohibition in the early 1900s, for example, when we experimented with making alcohol illegal. And of course, alcohol at the time was very dangerous because people were making it in their bathtubs. People used bathtub gins, for example. And once we legalized alcohol, all of a sudden the industry became legitimized, and we now have a thriving and flourishing alcohol industry here in the United States. Something like that would grow up here in the United States, just like we see the cannabis culture growing up in states like Colorado and places like California. And my own home state of Missouri just legalized medical marijuana, and we are on track to legalize recreational as well. So, you know, I'm a person who got booed at a presidential debate for saying that you shouldn't be able to sell heroin to 5-year-olds, right? Obviously, kids need to be protected from these dangerous substances. But it's one of the reasons that we have the cartels and the danger on the southern border is a direct result of prohibition. We didn't learn our lessons from Al Capone in the early 1900s. We need to learn our lessons from the earlier experiment in prohibition. Now, one of the interesting things he brought up was the concept of coyotes and how people, illegal immigrants will pay thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars to coyotes to have the coyotes bring them to the United States, in which it's a very dangerous situation, especially for young women, many of them who are being raped before they come to the United States. Some of those statistics are very startling. However, that brings me to one of my key points that was going to be the end I was hoping to bring up, which is some solutions, which is why don't we take the money that those illegals would have been spending on the coyotes and use that to offset the debt of the United States, use that to offset the tax burden of the United States. You see, the more people that move to the United States, the smaller the national debt burden becomes on the rest of this. So while it may not be fair to immigrants, we could do things like forcing them to pay higher taxes and then allocate those taxes to natives like you and me so that we could actually pay lower taxes. Now, their children then would not be required to do that, but that might be the price of admission. So rather than take that money and have that be paid to the coyotes, why not have that paid to Uncle Sam in the U.S. Treasury, and then we all pay lower taxes? Another thing that he talked about was the question of the rule of law. My name's Austin, which comes from St. Augustine, and of course Aquinas once famously said that an unjust law is no law at all. This nation is planted thick with laws that are poorly written and randomly enforced, especially our war on drugs. Ending the war on drugs would be a major step in helping to solve the immigration crisis on the border. I don't advocate for no restrictions. He talked about diseases that are coming across. That is a serious problem, but that is a problem that would be solved, like I mentioned in my intro, with an Ellis Island style system, where if you come here with an infectious disease, you would have to return. Security check, disease check, done.
Thank you. We're going to get into some of the specifics on immigration, to allow you guys to elaborate a little more on your policy perspective. So, Mr. Petersen, you've called for the abolition of ICE. Can you explain a little bit your theory for why that's a good idea and how the government will find alternatives for combating human trafficking?
Sure. So my concept is that instead of having a federal agency, remember the Department of Homeland Security was only established in the early 2000s by President George W. Bush, and of course, you know, being for limited government, why do we want to create another police agency to do what the states should be doing? So my argument is simply that states like Texas and California and Arizona and New Mexico that have problems with illegal immigration should be able to set their own rules and regulatory policy for the people who want to come into their states. So do we need another federal enforcement agency to solve these problems? I'm sorry, but if the post office can't even properly deliver the mail and run it at a profit, why do you think that another massive FDR-style public works program on our southern border that's going to raise spending raise taxes and steal land from Republicans in Texas through eminent domain, such as we are doing right now, is going to solve the problems of illegal immigration. I want less illegal immigration, right? But that means that we need more legal immigration. The problem with the Republican Party's stance right now is that it's at odds with one another. It's oxymoronic in the sense that the Republican Party is trying to stifle not just illegal immigration, they're trying to stifle legal immigration. Now, if you reduce the amount of legal immigrants who can come into the United States, what is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to more illegal immigration. So if you want more legal immigration and less illegal immigration, then you have to legalize people coming here to the United States. Now, if a foreigner wants to come here to the United States and work a job, that's a private contract. If they want to be employed by someone, that's a private contract. That's not a welfare program. During World War II, we created a Bracero program. This Bracero program continued until the early 1960s here in the United States, where Mexican workers could work on American farms. Now, that wasn't necessarily a path to citizenship, but for some it was, and it helped boost our economy, especially because at the time we had started during the war. We were still in the Great Depression. It wasn't until after the war. So a boost to our economy. More than 100 people have stated that 100 million people have stated that they would move to the United States if they could. And I say let them, if they desire, as long as they pay their taxes and perhaps an entrance fee instead of to the coyotes.
Okay, well, you heard that. Mr. Petersen says that ICE gets abolished and the hundreds of human trafficking arrests that ICE makes will get made up by the states. Do you have a response?
Yeah, I don't think that's logical because you put an unduly burden on those specific states that are border states. I mean, you got to think, when people come into this country, they may come through Texas, they may come through Arizona, but they don't stay there. They go into places, or they also may come through California, but they go all around the nation. So to put that burden on individual states is, in my opinion, unfair. The reason why we have ICE that is a federal agency is because it relieves the burdens of other federal agencies. And here's the thing, people like to focus, when they think about ICE, they like to focus on just immigration. ICE does immigration, but ICE also does things related to terrorism and trafficking and other things that this government and our society needs to be intact. Another thing is, it sounds good. It really sounds, I guess, helpful to say that anybody that wants to come to America to work, come on in as long as you pay taxes. I mean, you can even look at the situation in America today. I don't think we have enough space for a lot of the people that we already have. And assuming that everybody who comes here have the dedication that American citizens do, some of the prosperous ones, they have the dedication to work. A lot of people that come here from other countries, they may not even speak English. So they may not even be able to assimilate properly. It's not in our best interest just to allow anybody, whomever wants to come to America, to be here. I think that immigration is more complex than that. You need to be assimilated when you do come to America, and there needs to be an actual place for you. I don't agree with us paying for or creating our own coyote system because it's just illegitimate. I think that we have immigration that is legal in this country. We allow over 1 million people a year to come into America. We're the most generous country on planet Earth. I think that we can maximize what we already do and be more effective. We should not let people just come as they will. We should allow people to come through a system. I'm more in favor of a merit-based system where if you come to America from another country, then you're going to help us prosper and do well. Not just so you can come here. My analogy is that people are hungry and they skip over McDonald's to come to a steakhouse. You don't just get to come to the steakhouse that we have developed and created just because you feel like it. You need to adhere to the American dream and have that as a prerequisite before you come into this country. And that's, I guess, that's my stance on that as far as what the gentleman said.
I'm trying to do my Don Lemon impersonation. We have a rigorous schedule. I will give you a rebuttal. Why are you giving away the steak? Is there no steak here in America?
Well, I want to say something very quickly about terrorism here. He's talking about terrorism here, and unfortunately, this rests on a fallacy called numeracy. You see, if you didn't walk outside because there might be lightning, today might be a bad day to use this analogy, but if you never walked outside because you might get hit by lightning, then you wouldn't have a very happy life. Cars are much more dangerous than airplanes, and yet more people are afraid of getting in airplanes than they are of getting in cars. From 1975 to 2015, foreign-born terrorists were responsible for 88% of all deaths on U.S. soil. But from 1975 to 2015, there were 772,000 murders in the United States. 99% of those were not from terrorism. Murders were actually less than 1% of all deaths. So terrorism is a tiny sliver of all of the problems that the United States faces when it comes to death. So if you're sitting in your bed, you could hide under your bed all night and worry about the fears of terrorism and not live a happy life, but you would be suffering from the fallacy called numeracy.
Two points here.
Yeah.
First of all, the reason why terrorism has gone down is because we actually apply laws and we strategically counteract terrorism on a day-to-day basis. We have become more strategic about it. That's why we have been able to eliminate a lot of it. But 9/11 was a huge example of foreign terrorists who came to this country.
And they came here through the legal system.
Well, they came here
legally. They
still inevitably came here and did damage to this country.
Sure.
That's why we have laws in place. That's why ICE was enforced and enabled to prevent things like that from happening, even if it's through a legal process. It's not just legal or illegal, it's thwarting the opportunity for terrorists to come to this country, which is something that ICE has done very, very well in this country since 9/11. That's why we haven't seen that type of terrorist activity from foreign people.
And we created the TSA and they haven't caught a single terrorist.
Because they're deterrents.
Guys,
they're not going to come through the TSA because there's the TSA.
Guys, respect you guys.
All right, got you done.
Okay, we're going to move on to something that you guys both kind of touched on. Mr. Petersen, we'll start with you. You're a staunch opponent of the war on drugs. Mr. Tatum here is a former officer who's no doubt taken drugs off the street during his tenure in law enforcement. Is he wrong to oppose legalization of drugs?
Of course. I mean, I could argue the morality, I could argue the economics. Let's start with the moral point first. The question is, do you own your life? Do you own your body? Do you get to decide what to do with it, provided that you harm no one else? The libertarian argument is that you own your own body. Individualism and self-expression. I think that one of the problems with the legalization of drugs is that we don't actually know how dangerous illegal drugs might actually be because we're not allowed to study them in our universities, like Arizona State University. There could be some severe health problems that are associated with smoking marijuana or even vaping marijuana. As a matter of fact, right now we are going through a discovery process to determine whether or not many of the people who have suffered deaths as a result of vaping have done so because of the cannabis THC vapes that they've been using in the United States. But one of the reasons we've been able to determine that is because it's been legal for universities to study it. Now, I'm not going to go out there and advocate for people to do drugs, even though they always work for me. I'll just simply say that, that's a joke. I'll just simply say that for me, I'll go back to the arguments of prohibition. You know, it didn't work when Al Capone went out there and made his millions off of prohibition. In essence, Milton Friedman once said it this way. He said that if you look at prohibition, the role of the government is to protect the cartel. So by making these substances illegal, the government protects the cartel's interests. The cartels are on the record saying they do not want to see legalization in the United States. Frequently, in recent years, I've been reading about articles where cartels that were importing marijuana into the United States have been forced to start manufacturing tomatoes or other drugs or things like that in order to legitimize their businesses. Many of one of our former presidents of the United States, John F. Kennedy, his entire family's wealth was built off of a cartel from alcohol prohibition. And then, of course, once it was legalized, then the scandal was over, but they built their entire family legacy off of the trade of illegal substances. So do I think that it's a problem, that drug addiction is a problem in the United States? Yes, but the government is not going to be able to provide us with viable solutions. These solutions have to come from our communities, from our families, from our friends, from our neighbors, from our churches. We always complain about how the socialists and the leftists on the other side of the aisle look at a problem and say, well, there has to be a government solution for it. So why is it that conservatives and Republicans do the same when it comes to this issue? That's my point.
Ready? Okay. So I think that you have to be very clear when you're speaking about legalizing drugs. All drugs aren't created equal. We understand now the effects of alcohol, and the government taxate alcohol or use taxes to make money off of alcohol and make revenue at an astronomical amount. Alcohol kills more people and causes more problems than just about anything. Yet we have things like marijuana. Marijuana, as a former police officer, is not the biggest threat that I've seen out on the streets. I've never seen anybody in a car accident that caused fatalities that were high smoking weed. I've never seen anybody beat their wife up smoking marijuana. I've seen a tremendous amount of that with alcohol. Now, when you go to methamphetamines and you go to some of these other drugs, anybody know about Skid Row? Raise your hand if you know what Skid Row looks like. That is a precursor to the legalization of drugs. This is what happens to you when you do drugs such as cocaine, when you do crack, when you do methamphetamines, when you have heroin, fentanyl. All of these things cause a problem in society. People that believe in legalization of drugs, they forget that you do go out into the community and you do have effects on other people's lives. And in the current system that we have, unfortunately, if all you did was smoke crack and stay in your house, then the cops will never even, you had never had any dealings with the police officers. But the problem is when you smoke crack and you become addicted and you get sick and you go out and rob other people, that's when the government should step in and help assist in the protections of all citizens. Here's another thing. Legalization outright with no regulation or taxation, the government will never do because it's not beneficial for them to gain revenue. The only reason marijuana is being legalized is because the government wants to make revenue. It's not legalized because it's morally right. It's not legalized because they feel like people have freedoms. It's legalized because they can make a tax revenue on those things. And anything outside of that, then you will proliferate cartel dealing and people who are selling drugs that are laced. I don't know if anybody heard of Sherm. It's marijuana laced with embalming fluid. Those things, when the government legalizes those things and put taxes on them and regulate them, they can eliminate young people going out and getting these drugs that are not processed properly and that can kill individuals. And we have seen that through heroin in the state of Arizona. Heroin mixed with fentanyl is becoming more and more fatal. And I don't believe that the government can ever regulate or make heroin legal in a sense that is functional and not detrimental to other people.
Well, it is legal because we have opioids, but if you're against legalizing drugs, then you should be for immigration, because the average immigrant is actually more socially conservative than the average native on issues like gay marriage, drug legalization, free speech, and abortion. So if you are against, or if you're for the war on drugs, then you should be for immigration, because they're socially conservative.
There's two differences, immigration and legal immigration. We don't even know how many legal immigrants are in this country, so we don't know what their stance is politically. And I would guarantee you almost your money back that they're probably voting Democrat, especially the illegal ones in California.
Actually, they don't vote Democrat to the degrees that they would. The illegal immigrants who are high school dropouts, only 24% of those people actually try to participate in an election. Even most Americans don't participate in elections. I believe in 2012, only 74% of registered voters in the United States who could vote did so. And of legal immigrants, only 48% of legal immigrants who were eligible to vote actually voted. So, again, numeracy, another problem.
If I could just focus, Mr. Petersen, I want to hear a rebuttal for what Tatum said, specifically within regards to people who smoke crack. They don't just smoke crack in their house and relax and chill out. They come outside and they commit crimes because the drug breaks down their nervous system and so on and so forth. Can you describe how your system of legalization is going to kind of make up for instances of drugs that kind of just forces a breakdown of the community?
Sure. Well, one of the things that you have to give up is you have to give up the sort of left-wing socialist concept of utopianism. One of the biggest traps that leftists fall into is that they're going to offer you a perfect world, a socialist utopia where everyone will be taken care of. I don't offer you any kind of a socialist utopia or a perfect world, libertarian utopia where it's a paradise where everyone will always be taken care of, there won't be drug addicts, and no one will commit crimes. There will still be people who will use drugs, who will abuse them, who will commit crimes. The question is, can we engage in harm reduction activities? And I think, like you say, a lot of police officers are saying that marijuana doesn't cause harm to our communities, so therefore it ought to be legalized. One of the reasons why people seek out methamphetamines or crack cocaine is because they cannot get legal alternatives for the kinds of drugs that they seek. Now, some people can get legal alternatives to heroin, things like opioids, oxycodone, and other that. Well, some of the biggest problems that we have in the United States are with the legal drugs, and that's with a regulated system that we have right now. We have prescription drug monitoring programs across the United States, except for in my home state of Missouri, which has successfully resisted that for the past several years. But even the prescription drug monitoring programs aren't immune to the law of unintended consequences. The law of unintended consequences has shown that in a system where people can go and get legal drugs, when the government steps in and places something like a prescription drug monitoring program over the top of the people, What happens is that the people go and they seek, the drug addicts, the ones who are the bad actors, go and seek the illegal alternatives, because people who want to engage in bad behavior, like theft, crime, murder, what have you, are going to engage in those activities, and there's no amount of a priori restraint that can be engaged in order to stop people from behaving in a certain way. I mean, how much of your freedom are you willing to give up in order to stop gun violence? Well, would you give up your guns? No, of course not. So then why can't you apply that to things like drugs or any other issues? There's a certain, freedom is dangerous, but I prefer it to the alternative. I think Thomas Jefferson once famously said that timid men prefer the calm of despotism to the boisterous sea of liberty. And we could live under despotism. We could live under, like Dwight Eisenhower once famously said, if you want to be perfectly safe, you can go to prison. There you'll get 3 hots and a cot every day. The only thing lacking is freedom. So the question is do we want to try and strike a balance between liberty and security in the United States? Or would we rather live dangerously? Meaning that will we tip the scales in favor of liberty? Socialism is risk averse. That's why they're not entrepreneurs as much on the left, right? Conservatism and libertarianism is revolutionary. It's very risky. It requires people to be able to take risks. But if you're not free to make mistakes, you're not really free at all.
So I will argue this, it sounds good until you apply it to reality, right? Because if you're going to legalize all the drugs, then you might as well legalize other crimes. Why is rape illegal? You can legally carry a firearm and defend yourself. But that's not the principle. The thing is that you want to have laws in place so we can have at least a line of managing what's going on. We don't need a free-for-all. Because there are people who cannot protect themselves, people who are handicapped, young children. That's why laws are put in place for us to have a standard to work from and not just have people doing whatever they want to do. I do agree that we can minimalize government at points where it makes sense. It just doesn't make sense to legalize all of the drugs that are in our society, because people tend to conflate drug users with drug dealers, and that's going back to the war on drugs. People who are drug users aren't the ones spending inherent amounts of time in prison, it's the drug dealers. We're not sitting in everybody's house making sure they're not smoking weed and doing something they're not supposed to do. When you become so intrusive with your behaviors that you prevent someone else from living out the life that they are granted to live in America, then that's when it becomes a problem. So I'm telling you, people that do their own dirt in their own house under our current system of laws, they typically get away with stuff. Police don't catch every drunk driver. Police don't catch all those people. But what we do is when we do catch you, you're going to pay a penalty. And to rebut kind of what you said about going to prison and being safe, to be honest, you're not safe in prison. You go to prison, you're going to get raped, and you're going to be jumped into a gang in most situations. So it's not a very safe place to go. And that's why laws are put into place so that people can have a landmark.
So our legal system can't even keep people who are under the government's administration safe. So how do they expect to keep people who are not under the government's administration safe?
Again, your argument is going back to the utopia. They didn't promise you utopia in prison, but they can just imagine if there was no guards in prison. How much will be going on? Imagine what would happen if murder wasn't against the law. What would happen if domestic violence or assault with domestic violence being the purview wasn't against the law?
So the government can't keep drugs out of prisons, but somehow they're going to keep drugs out of all these people's houses. I'm just curious, where are these angels that are going to administrate this system that can possibly stop all these people from owning drugs or using drugs if they can't even stop people in prison from doing drugs?
It's not about complete elimination, it's about setting boundaries so we can minimize the fallout. It's just like your children. Like anybody in here who have children, you just let your child do whatever they want to do, you can go and do. No, you have to set boundaries. Are they going to mess up? Are they going to make mistakes? Yes. The disciplinary factors that you put into place will deter them from making those mistakes.
So government is our parent.
In some cases, they have to be, unless you want to be a complete lawless society.
Don't tell me it was a good time.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to switch gears to foreign policy really quickly. Mr. Petersen, the president has pushed an American first foreign policy to restore America's place in the world. As a result, we saw the president put tariffs from Libyan goods onto China in order to make up for the many ways that China undercuts the United States economy. Was that a good idea?
Well, no, because right now we're not even attacking the sincere problem that began the trade war with China. The trade war began as a result of China's theft of intellectual property from American corporations. That is a sincere problem, but it's not the one that's being addressed right now. Right now, we have devolved the trade war into an argument over how many soybeans China is going to be buying. So we're not even having a trade debate about the issues of intellectual property, which is where really the debate needs to be happening right now. Missouri farmers and the Missouri Soybeans Association, where I live, are now talking about whether or not they're going to be able to keep many of their family farms in business. The biggest problem of this is that with these farms, you know, the small farms are the ones that get shut down, not the big corporations, because they're the ones who are going to be getting the subsidies. And here we are, you know, talking about making America great again. I'm sorry, but when did farmers become such welfare queens and go to the President of the United States and start demanding handouts? The President of the United States just tweeted last week that the farmers of the United States who were impacted by the trade wars are going to be getting big, fat welfare checks from me and from you to pay for the problems that the President of the United States has created. No one wins in a trade war. And who pays the tariffs, by the way? China doesn't pay the taxes, right? We pay the tariffs. We pay the taxes on those things. So it's sort of like a situation where, you know, we are throwing rocks in our own harbor. Now, if China wants to raise tariffs, engage in communism and socialism and taxation, and if they want to throw rocks in their own harbors by raising taxes on their own people, let them, but don't follow suit. We shouldn't raise taxes on our own people. The way to fight socialism is with capitalism. You don't fight communism with communism.
I'll just go a basic premise, because I'm not really huge in tariffs and all of these different things, but I'm just going off the factors that I've researched, right? Tariffs is not something new to anyone in the Republican Party. It's not new. Obama did it. Reagan did it. I would like to see the president be strong, unlike other presidents, when it comes to our foreign relations. And the president of the United States has decided to take this measure. He claims, and I'm going off of his claims, that billions of dollars is flowing back into America, which would afford us to be able to help the farmers in the desperation time of need. So I'm leaning towards saying, let's see where this ends up, because I believe that the president has something going. I believe that it's too early to determine that he's somehow in a big flaw as it relates to his tariffs that he put on to China. So I like to say this is not a precedent that has been set by President Trump. I would like to see what happens as a result of this, but I want to give him a little time to let that come to fruition before I make a negative judgment against him.
Do you think that the farmers should get the welfare subsidies?
Well, you got to look at the big picture. If that's what's necessary in a temporary position until we can get things rolling, then I'm okay with that, given the fact that President Trump ran on this in his campaign, and he's just really exercising his campaign promise.
We distribute the wealth. Yeah.
They've been getting it since 1933, though.
So we should imitate the comments in FDR.
So on that note, what do you think about the president's decision to stand firm? What do you have to say about Mr. Tatum's appreciation for the president attempting to fight China?
I'll tell you honestly,
how would you differ from the president's policy?
Actually, I would say this. I've always said from the very beginning, if the president of the United States gets concessions out of China, if all of this trade war bluster ends with him being a brilliant negotiator who manages to get China to lower their tariffs on American exported products, I would bow down and kiss him on the seat and say, congratulations, Mr. President, this is a giant coup for you. I want the United States to do well. I want the American farmers to do well. We have to be exporting our products around the world. I think one of the problems, unfortunately, is that people believe that the United States needs to maintain a certain standard of living from blue-collar jobs or factory jobs or industrial jobs. This is why we see the rise of Democratic candidates like Andrew Yang with their universal basic income, because we've always had in the United States, not just since 1933, but since the Gilded Age, Luddites in the United States, people who fear the rise of technology, people who rightfully fear the rise of technology. We used to send people around with horses and buggies to deliver ice to people's boxes, and that industry, of course, doesn't exist because we now have refrigerators. But like I was talking about in my opening, the dynamism and spontaneous order of the American society is one where revolutionary and radical changes can dramatically change our economy overnight. Capitalism is disruptive, but you have to allow the marketplace to work in order for it to work. So too much intervention into the marketplace by the commander-in-chief causes distortions. The biggest problem that we're facing right now is because of the supply chains that used to be routed to the United States from places like China and from the Middle East are now going to places like Brazil. They're going to South America. Once you create a supply chain, it's extremely expensive, and it takes sometimes decades to reroute a supply chain. It actually becomes cheaper for you to maintain trade through that supply chain rather than create a new supply chain. So now that China is rerouting trade to foreign countries in South America and other places, why would they spend all the money and time coming and bringing their products or trading with the United States when they have a less expensive supply chain? So you have to look at the economy as an organic creature. It's not something that you can just, it's not like what John Maynard Keynes thought it was, right? Where you can just kind of like fill it full of fuel and drive it like a truck. The economy is organic, and it operates over a series of years, of decades.
Okay, well, staying with foreign policy, and I'll give you a chance to kind of expand on your view of the president kind of being bold with regards to foreign policy. Both of you have expressed concerns about American involvement in foreign conflicts, but Mr. Tatum, you stopped short of calling for a complete military reduction internationally. Mr. Petersen likes the idea of a complete withdrawal militarily. Why is he wrong?
Well, I think that when you think about the conflicts well, I'll say it like this. We've gone too far to come all the way back. You know what I'm saying? We're too deep in my opinion, for us to completely eliminate our military across the world. What I will say is I'm for mitigating, continuing into endless wars and spending billions of dollars of our military resources and the lives of our military personnel. But I had this conversation with Dan Crenshaw, and he, like myself, and obviously he's more informed about the military expression because he was in the military, but it doesn't make sense for us to just completely remove ourselves in a conflict that we control or we are able to manage, because then you create vacuums that people are talking about when it comes to ISIS and other things like that. So in the sense of places where our military personnel have expertise in this and they want to lead troops there, I'm supportive of that. I do not think that we have to expand, or we should reevaluate the expansion of our resources militarily in places where we do not benefit as a country.
So when he said, thank you very much, some good points there. One of the points he made is we're too far gone. Has anybody here ever been gambling? Ever gone to a casino and sat down at a table and started gambling and started losing, and then you kept losing and you kept losing, and you said to yourself, there's no way I can keep losing, I've got to win at some point. So what Brandon has expressed here is what's known as the sunk cost fallacy. Sunk cost fallacy is the idea that once you get yourself into a situation that's bad, it can't possibly get any worse. Well, I'm here to tell you, it can get worse. You know, people like Dan Crenshaw, people like John McCain, no offense, I know you're from Arizona, are some of the reasons that we have so many of the negative consequences of immigration and migration to places like Europe. Bringing this back to immigration. You know, the reason why they have a problem with Syrian refugees in Europe is because of the conflict in Syria. Much of it fomented by the presence of American forces in there. Now, I'm not one of those libertarians who thinks that the United States is the great evil, the great cause of all the conflicts. I agree that there are people who do hate us for our freedoms, but the answer is not to get rid of our freedoms in order to appease the terrorists, but it can get worse. And actually, the thing that I agree with the president out of more than anything has been his foreign policy. When President Trump talks about America first, he's referencing a philosophy and ideology that some of you might be familiar with called paleoconservatism, which has a lot in common with libertarianism when it comes to foreign policy. America first should mean America first, not Syria first, not Afghanistan first, not the Middle East first, but America first. And so Trump-esque foreign policy, a paleoconservative foreign policy, while it has its isolationist tendencies, has some very strong non-interventionist ones as well. The president was right to fire Ambassador John Bolton, and as we're finding out with these impeachment hearings this week, the Ambassador Bolton and the neoconservative war hawks behind him and others who were cheering him on was fomenting chaos within the president's cabinet and was disrupting foreign policy. These people never saw a war that they didn't like, and many of them are chicken hawks and never served. I'm sorry, were you in the military?
No.
Okay, so many of these people, of course, who advocate for war never served, right? Not people, of course, like John McCain or people like Dan Crenshaw, but then, of course, like I said earlier, to a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So to me, I think the president needs to obey his instincts, follow his instincts. I've advocated that he needs to hire Tulsi Gabbard, who agrees with him very much on foreign policy. Maybe I'm not much on else, but let's look across the aisle sometimes for some of the solutions that we have. So the foreign policy that we have right now is one of the direct results of the problems of the migration crises that we're solving right now. Europe is suffering not just because of the immigration, but because the immigration is caused by disastrous foreign policy. The president should follow his instincts, and congratulations on firing Ambassador Bolton. He's been one of the millstones around our neck.
Well, I want to see if I can find some differences here. So, the President Trump has dropped the mother of all bombs. He has, he has authorized raids against al-Baghdadi. Those instances of foreign involvement in conflict, would you support those actions?
Well, I have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, but I mean, there are certain things that, when it comes to, there's a difference between rhetoric and policy. Like, oftentimes the president will behave in a way that contradicts what he actually says, right? So you have to take a look at each individual action, such as itself, and judge it based on its merit. I could give you my, overall foreign policy, which is one of non-interventionism, a strong national defense. But I mean, like, another example of like rhetoric where it doesn't match up with his actions. President Obama was known as the deporter-in-chief, right? The Obama administration deported 1.18 million people in his first 3 years. But President Trump has only deported 800,000 people in his first 3 years. The Obama administration also deported 409,849 people in 2012, while the Trump administration has yet to deport 260,000 people in a year. So again, while President Trump talks a big game on deportations and send them home, Obama was the great deporter-in-chief, and I guess we have a lot to thank, we libertarians, for President Trump being such a dove on immigration.
Let me tell you this real quick. When you're talking about the conflict as if the gambling scenario that he spoke about, that's not the scenario that I'm implementing. The scenario is that when you get into a fight, are you going halfway fight, halfway through the fight? That's not legitimate. You're already in the fight. You have a vested interest to be in a fight. You better keep punching, or you're going to take an L at the end of the day. It's better for us to fight them there than to fight them here. That's the argument that Dan Crenshaw has, and I agree with him. Because the same thing with Baghdadi and all these other people, we didn't defeat him in America. We didn't defeat him with people coming to America and doing harm. We did it on their turf. And I believe that there's inferences or places that we should implement our military on their turf to prevent them from coming to America and causing harm. We may agree on a lot of the restriction of military personnel being in these endless wars. I think we may agree with that. But to eliminate our military action across the board indefinitely is a huge mistake. And I don't think anybody in history has even constituted that, implemented that, and has shown in history that has been effective to remove our military personnel from some of the conflicts that we've started.
Ronald Reagan did it in Lebanon when the bombing of our Marine Force barracks. He said that this is a pointless struggle, that we shouldn't be involved there, and he pulled the troops out, and we saw no acts of terrorism against U.S. troops there. It's hard to commit acts of terrorism against people who aren't there.
It definitely is the problem. And in isolated cases, I agree that we should do that, just like what the president did in his term. But to indefinitely feel like that's a tactic to use, I disagree.
Well, I don't think it wouldn't be indefinite. I mean, this is an old debate that goes back to Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton, who established our system of commerce here in the United States, our banking system here in the United States, he was an advocate of a system called mercantilism, which is the idea that is the role of the United States to protect Americans on the high seas. Thomas Jefferson disagreed with him, and to his credit, when Thomas Jefferson became president of the United States, he had a deal with the Tripolitan pirates, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. But one of the things that's not talked about from that conflict in American history with the conflict of the Tripolitan pirates is that while Thomas Jefferson did send the U.S. Marines to Tripoli, he also issued, with congressional approval, a little-known letter of marque and reprisal, which I would urge you to look up in your Constitution. The U.S. Constitution allows for the Congress to issue letters of marque and reprisal at the behest of the President of the United States. And essentially what would happen is instead of engaging in extrajudicial killings, such as the one as al-Baghdadi and others, what you would do is you would legitimize it constitutionally by having the Congress issue a proper letter of marque and reprisal, and then of course you have the price on their head, and then the President of the United States could call for not just maybe a SEAL Team 6 to kill them, but you put a bounty on their heads to allow people like myself to go out there and start my own private defense company and kill terrorists if I so choose. Free market way to solve terrorism.
As long as you're not high when you're doing it.
Interesting. Okay, so we're getting down to the wire here, folks, and I'm going to let everyone out relatively on time. So we'll just do one more quick question. So I think nothing illustrates the difference between traditional republicanism, conservatism, and libertarianism more than the issue of the Second Amendment. So both of you actually have a unique perspective. You support nonviolent felons owning firearms, correct?
Right. For me, yeah. I mean, people who serve their
terms. Correct. Now, I think the difference is you support even violent felons who have served their time owning firearms, whereas you do not, correct? Yeah. So can you describe to me why perhaps violent felons, after serving their time, should be allowed to own firearms?
Well, I've always believed that if someone is too dangerous to own a gun, then they're too dangerous to be on the streets. And the idea behind rehabilitation, or do we have a system that is meant to punish people, or is it meant to rehabilitate people? If the point is to rehabilitate people to allow them to go back into society, then yes, they should have their rights restored. They should have their full rights restored, and that's my argument there. But I mean, again, that's much more his territory on this one. We could disagree, agree to disagree. It seems small and pedantic. I'm just upset with the Trump administration for getting rid of my bump stocks. So, I like the idea of whatever is done when it comes to firearms, it needs to be done by the Congress, and it needs to be done so constitutional.
Okay. Officer Tatum on the street patrolling and encounters a former felon with an aggravated assault with a firearm.
Yeah, unfortunately in our society, a lot of times when people go to jail for violent crimes, they go out and they recidivate, right? They go out and they do more crimes and they commit things like that. Now, we all know that just because you're a prohibited possessor doesn't mean that somehow you're not going to get a gun, but I think that it serves as a level of deterrent, and we do get a lot of guns off the streets from convicted felons. There is two sides to this, because if you committed a crime that is a felony and it's non-violent and it doesn't involve firearms, like mass murder and different things like that, and mass murder, of course, you would probably be in jail for the rest of your life, but murdering people, when you get out of prison, if you murder people with firearms, I think that it should be restricted from you. That's kind of like a kid. If you do something like my son, I gave him a cell phone, he did something he shouldn't have done with a cell phone, you can get a whooping and lose a cell phone. You know what I'm saying? That if you get both of them. And so when you go to prison for violent crimes, such as shooting, people or whatever, and you get out, you can lose your rights. If it's non-violent, you can retain your rights if you've done good and had a level of adequate reassociation into the public. Here's another aspect that I was thinking about regarding this. Dang, I just lost my train of thought. You go ahead and I'll come back.
I mean, honestly, I would say that I could be convinced on this subject. I mean, it's not something that I feel extremely strongly about, but my argument is that if we're worried that somebody might commit a violent crime, don't let them out.
Right. I mean, that could be the case, but we do see faulty behaviors in the court system to a certain degree. People that commit some violent crimes, they have an opportunity to do what we call a plea deal, which some people get half of their sentence and things like that, which allow them to be out earlier than what they probably should be. And then also in our justice system, which I think that we have to work on, the president has done a good job with the First Step Act, is to reacclimate people back into society. So when you're in prison and you get released from prison, we've seen it on the state level, but Trump did it on the federal level, we have to have a level of getting people prepared to be back into society. And I'm willing to bend on this too, because if you can re-enter people into society, back into society in a more equitable way, then maybe we can consider being more flexible on allowing them to get some of their rights restored. Because firearm rights aren't the only ones. People can't vote when they come out as a convicted felon and other things like that. So I think that if we can work the prison system, we can have people do real time and not some of this faulty stuff that we see going on, and actually help them to be reintroduced into society again after committing violent crimes, even if they're getting psychological help or whatever the case may be. I think we can be flexible on it, but as it stands right now with our justice system, I think if you commit violent crimes with firearms, then hey man, you just lost that right.
Well, I could listen to these guys argue forever, so please round of applause for our two players. Someone to help with voter registration. Is there someone here who's a voter registration person? Okay, so if anyone needs to register to vote, please see this gentleman here. Thank you for coming.